Happy Friday, everybody. Good morning to you. The sun is finally out in Woodburn, Kentucky. I thought it wasn't coming back, y'all. The eclipse came, and I just didn't think the sun was ever going to shine again. We've had a really gray week, have we not? But today so far is beautiful, and I hope you're having a good morning. It's Friday. It's the end of another good week in the Word, and we're finishing up First Chronicles with chapter 14 today. First Chronicles chapter, we're not finishing First Chronicles, but you know what I mean. We are reading First Chronicles chapter 14 today. Are you doing okay? I really appreciate your being with me. I appreciate your time in the Word and the fact that you share that with me. God bless you. Chapter 14. Yesterday we were in that really dark story about how Uzzah, had reached up to touch the Ark of the Covenant that was off balance in its travels, and God broke out against him. David's afraid of God now, parked the Ark of the Covenant at the house of Obed-Edom, and then just goes on with his life. It's what it seems like. Chapter 14 is kind of an interlude. We'll return to the Ark of the Covenant, but right now I think it's one of those moments in the story where we're just sort of, led to see how time goes by before they go back and get the Ark of the Covenant. So time goes by. And as time goes by, God just blesses David. God blesses David, and it's all God's doing. And I don't think we're supposed to read anything else into it. It's all God's doing. We start in verse 1, verses 1 and 2. David builds a palace, all because of the generosity of King Hiram of Tyre. We've talked about Tyre before. It's a coastal city. It's very famous for its maritime trade. Tyre, again, because of its location, it's easy to ship things. And so they're able to ship building supplies over to the king of Israel, to David. And it was a great blessing to him. Along with cedar timber, stonemasons, carpenters to build him a palace. King Tyre, man, he comes through. He's going to do it again for Solomon later, but at this point, David gets his palace. But again, notice verse 2, David realized that it's the Lord. It's the Lord that has confirmed him as king. It's the Lord that's greatly blessed him. This is all from the Lord. So once more, as we've been saying, God's working, but God's working through people. And even though it's the king of Tyre that keeps calling David saying, "What do you need?" David recognizes that this is God's way of protecting him and providing for him. It's through people, including great nations like Tyre and King Hiram there. Now, after that, verses 3 to 7, David's wives and children. Are you like me? First off, like me, I'm just saying, like, what? Like, I've never heard of these people, just to be honest. The names listed here, Eliphalet, and Elpalet. What? Can you imagine, oh my goodness. Shobab, Ibhar, Elishua, and Elishama. What? Well, just to remind you, because we saw this, and I told you to skim, so I can't get on you now if you don't remember. But in chapter 3, verses 1 through 4, First Chronicles chapter 3, verse 1 through 4, the descendants, we had the genealogy of David there, and we realized that David's children are kind of divided into two groups. I know, ain't none of this, good, but it is what it is. So there are two groups. The first are the children born when he was king of Judah for about 7.5 years. And then these are the ones in chapter 14 born when he was in Jerusalem, this longer reign. So there are 4 here by Bathsheba, and then something like 9, born by somebody else. Deuteronomy chapter 17, I think it's verse 17, says plainly that the king is not supposed to take a whole lot of wives. In my mind, I think one would be enough, but Deuteronomy specifically says that the king must not do exactly what David is doing. And the chronicler sort of passes over it without comment, but he knows that we all got thoughts. We all got thoughts about this. It's like, David, you dummy, Now, the rest of this chapter, I think, is meant to show us how David consults with God. David doesn't take a step without consulting with God, except when it comes to his romantic life, to his marriage life, And don't you see that? You see people who are so wise and careful, and they pray and they seek the Lord until they fall in love, and they just marry, some skanky woman out there that they shouldn't ever dated in the first place. Or, if you're not seeing this with your own children, with your friends, here's this godly man, this godly woman, who seems to be so, just seeking the Lord, and then they just, marry, anybody. They just date anybody. And it's like, what is this blind spot, or this way we compartmentalize out our family life or our relational life? I said it when we read Abraham's story, how all the stories about Abraham are good except the stories that involve Sarah, his wife, And David's the same way. It's like all of the stories about David are good stories, except the stories that have to do with his family. And that is not something that you and I should just fly over. David is careful to consult the Lord, but I'm not sure he was consulting the Lord, marrying all these, foreign wives, when he lived in, just no, David, no, that's not okay. We got thoughts. Deuteronomy chapter 17, God's own word has thoughts, but David is so careful to consult the Lord and so careful to obey the Lord, except when it comes, to his love life. And then he is just, stupid, and I don't care. All of God's wisdom in the world is no match if you're still going to be stupid, and David knows better, but he does otherwise. And so anyway, that's my little spill, y'all. But do you know what I'm saying? And do you not see this? And some of us, it's in our own lives. You are so wise. You make such good decisions, except when it comes to marriage. And then you are so dumb. And why do you continue, to just like that first marriage didn't work out, and you think you learn your lesson, but you go right back and you marry a man just like the first guy, or a woman just like your ex-wife, who you say is the devil, but then you go back to the same bar, and meet another woman just like her and marry her. Like, are you not learning anything with your life? I'm sorry. So David marries all these wives, and we have another list of a whole nother bunch of kids. Now the ones born in Jerusalem. We don't really get all of his baby mamas, but you know this story. So let's move on. So Philistine trouble in verses 8 through 12. So you got nations like Tyre who sort of come around to establish and help and be an ally to Israel and to King David. But then you got the Philistines, other nations that will come against, will make war against Israel. And always an attack against Israel in Scripture is an attack against God himself. God is going to make war against those who make war against his people. But here, David, that there's several things that I think you're supposed to connect with this, with that. We only get one little story about Saul in Chronicles, but it's a story how he gets defeated by the Philistines, right? He consulted a medium, for example. He calls a Long Island medium, or whatever. He finds, Madam Kennedy with her crystal ball out on the bypass. Y'all remember that? Bowling Green back in the day, we had a fortune teller on the bypass. Her name was Madam Kennedy. Anyway, so Saul consulted Madam Kennedy. But notice how David is the antithesis of everything Saul did wrong, David does right. So David consults with God every time. In the story of his battles, again, marriage is aside, when it comes to David as a king leading the people into battle, he does it right every time. So right here, he consults God, he gets a word from God, marches out to meet them. It's just amazing. Notice a little bit of connection with chapter 13. God breaks out against his enemy. So they named that place Baal Perazim, which is very related to when they named the place Perez Uzzah, which means, God broke out against Uzzah. In this case, it's that same phrase, Perez there. It's that same phrase that has to do with breaking out. And this time it's God breaking out against his enemies. So again, interesting kind of parallel there. Notice that when the Philistines are defeated, is it that, in verse 12, Philistines are defeated and they abandon all their gods. Okay, I think you're supposed to flash back to chapter 10, verses 8 through 10, when Saul is defeated, the Philistines defeat him, and they cut off his head and they go put his head as a trophy before their gods. There's a celebration before their gods. But here with David, with God fighting for David, the Philistines are utterly defeated and they just leave their gods laying in the field like Saul was in the field. And then David destroys them like they destroyed Saul. You see that parallel? You see that connection? And then once more, verses 13 to 17, another second victory over the Philistines. And again, David consults with God. David gets God's instructions. And literally in this case, when you hear the sound like marching feet in the tops of the trees, it's this idea that like God's army, God is fighting for David and once more brings victory. So, the end of the chapter, David's fame spreads everywhere. The Lord caused all the nations to fear David. So again, it's kind of an interlude chapter. We're going to return to the story of the Ark of the Covenant in chapter 15 on Monday, chapter 15, verses 1 to 29. But here, this chapter that just shows how the Lord establishes David's throne as a blessing to Israel. So there you go. Good job, you all. Good reading. I will see you, if not in church, on Sunday morning, 8, 9:30, and 11 here at Woodburn Baptist Church. I'll see you Monday morning, 10 o'clock for 10 with Tim. Have a good weekend, you guys. I love you so much. I will see you Monday.